Good morning, folks. Can we all sit down and let's get this moving forward, please? Thank you. There's some free tables up here too, folks, and there's some free tables over here if you haven't found a table yet. They're wide open, so let's get seated down and everybody scared of the front area? Come on. There's some tables wide open right up here.
That's going to be for the person who said that right,
Okay.
right there, so he sees it.
Right here?
It's fine.
Okay. All right, good morning, folks. Good to see everybody here and made it through the weather, and good crowd here, so glad to see everybody made it safely. Well, welcome to the 2024 Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board Science Conference. If you don't know me, my name is Shannon Adams. I'm first of all an enrolled member of the Yakama Nation, and I'm also half Cherokee as well. I've worked for the Yakama Nation for over 30 years now as the Habitat Section Coordinator for the Yakama Nation Fisheries Resource Management. I have been a member of the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board for about 6 years now, and on behalf of the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board members and their staff, we all like to welcome you to the 2024 Science Conference. So just to go over, we would like to begin by thanking all the scientists and researchers who have worked on salmon recovery. Thank you to the volunteers from Wenatchee High School and Wenatchee Valley College who are helping with the conference. Thank you to the Wenatchee Convention Center for hosting the conference. Thank you to the sponsors and exhibitors. Thank you to the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board staff who have all worked hard to pull this year's conference together. Some of the sponsors that had sponsored this conference are the Yakama Nation, the Habitat Conservation Plan, Wells, Rocky Reach, and Rock Island Tributary Committee, the Governor's Recreation Conservation Office, Upper Columbia United Tribes, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Wolf Water Resources. Our gold sponsors are Anchor QEA, Aspec, a geosynthetic company, Bonneville Power Administration, Colville Confederate Tribes, Coastal Geological Services and Natural System Design, Four Peaks Environmental Science and Data Solutions, Interfluve, Habitat Subcommittee to the Priest Rapids Coordinating Committee. Silver sponsors include Bioanalysis Incorporated, Cascadia Conservation District, Kramer Fish Sciences, Snake River Salmon Recovery Board, and Tetra Tech. Exhibitors, we'd like to thank you, Washington Water Trust, Douglas County Public Utilities Districts, Hinch and Brook Incorporated, Habitat Conservation Plan, Wells Rocky Reach, and Rocky Island Tributary Committee, Yakama Nation, Washington State Conservation Commission, and Four Peaks Environmental Science and Data Solutions. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Tracy Hillman, who's going to talk about the theme of this year's science conference. Thank you all for showing up, and I hope you learn a lot today. Thanks.
Yeah, good morning. There we go. There for a minute, I thought I was at a quantum theory conference where everybody's in a different dimension. So, yeah, I want to thank you for being here. You know, I was looking at the bulletin. Here's the bulletin, and it's about PIBAS. So I was apparently looking at the wrong thing. But we have a theme. We do have a theme to this, and what I found is that the theme is intended to encourage dialogue about the scales at which we conceive, design, and implement recovery actions. But not only that, it's at the scale at which we do monitoring, or how we measure the effects of those actions. And I thought it was interesting. I started thinking back to when I started in this field of study, and that was back in the 80s. And yes, that was a long time ago. I'm aging myself. But I remember at that time, the research that we were doing was mostly focused on microhabitat. We wanted to understand the microhabitat of the fish. What were they using in the channel? What were their nose velocities, their depths, and things like that? And from that, some mathematical wizards took that information and they said, hey, we can make habitat models. We can develop like the physical habitat simulation model, or the HEP model, the habitat evaluation process model. And really, we stole a lot of that stuff from our colleagues over in the wildlife areas. But we were able to take that information, that small scale information, and develop habitat models. Over time, things evolved, and we had more technology. We were able to do more advanced things with that technology. And now we're evaluating habitat at the landscape scale. Okay, we've gone from the microhabitat scale to a landscape scale. And I think that is one of the themes of this conference, is to look at those different spatial scales at which we're evaluating fish, their responses to habitat actions, and their life history characteristics. Well, again, back when I was in the 80s, there was restoration work going on. There were people out doing restoration work, and in fact, it had started way before I entered the field. But at that time, their focus was mostly on the channel. A biologist would look at a channel and he'd say, you know, there's not a lot of cover in here, or there's not enough pools. And so they would do actions such as add wood. They actually added live plants, and they would put in rocks. How many of you remember the rock gabions? There were these wire baskets that were full of rocks, and some of you younger people have probably never heard of them or seen them, but there were people out there doing these. I worked with a person that did that, Bob House. He worked for the BLM at the time. He was putting out these wire baskets of rocks in the channel to create diversity, and it would scour out a pool, kind of like what wood does, and he monitored it, and he found that, hey, some of these were attracting fish, and they lasted for a couple of years. But then you had all this wire mesh in the stream that you later had to go clean out. But, you know, for whatever reason, we don't see a lot of those anymore. Probably for a good reason, right? And so that was kind of what we focused on. Our focus was on the channel. Today, with advances in technology, we are no longer just focused on the channel. In fact, we are encouraged to focus on the watershed and the valley, the floodplain. Now, most of us that were the cool kids at the time, we were focused on the channel. There were a few mavericks out there that were saying, hey, you know, don't forget the floodplain. We got the floodplain. It was like, we don't know how to deal with that. Let's leave that alone. We have all these constraints. We can't open that up. Let's leave it the way it is. Well, over time, we were able to overcome that hurdle, and now we are thinking out larger scales. So we've gone from the small scale, the microhabitat, to the landscape scale. And we've done restoration work at the small scale, and now we're starting to do restoration at a larger scale, all because of advances in science. Okay, that's the spatial scale aspect of this, right? There's another aspect of this. That's the temporal scale. Things change over time. Things change over time. And with climate change, invasive species, and things like that, we now have to start considering how things change at different scales, at different temporal scales. We're no longer locked in like we were in the 80s with trying to establish what we called a stable equilibrium. We called it an equilibrium because we thought that was a cool term for stability. We wanted our channel to be locked in place. Now we're learning that isn't the best thing to do, okay? Things change over time. We have to be including that in our designs. And so if you look at the presentations that we're going to have over this conference, it hits on several of these things that we just talked about. We need to understand habitat use. We have a number of speakers going to talk about habitat use at different spatial scales. Those all affect the survival and life histories of fish. We're going to have some presentations on that at different spatial scales. We also have a number of presentations on river process, restoration, and recovery, all that are at different spatial scales and temporal scales. And then finally, we have to include the human dimension. We have to include that component, right? There are constraints out there that we have to deal with. Now, I am reminded, as I shut this thing down, because you don't want to hear me, you want to hear people that actually have science. I'm reminded of something Dr. Ellen Wohl told. She actually gave a presentation to the RTT. I think it was pre-COVID, so it was a while ago. It was like 5 years ago. And this, if I remember correctly, I think this is what she said, and I didn't have it with me when I was flying in. I just found out yesterday I was supposed to talk today, so this is what I'm doing. This is, Dr. Wool says, interactions between form, that's what I was talking about, what we were doing in the 80s. We were looking at form and maintaining forms of channels. She says the interactions between forms and process create diversity and dynamics. Okay, let's break that down. Diversity, I believe what she meant by that is that that's the spatial variability in physical habitat. There's her space. Spatial scales, diversity. Dynamics, I think what she was saying is that those are changes in habitat conditions over time. She hit the theme of our conference. The interaction between form and process creates spatial variability in physical habitat and changes in habitat over time. A wonderful statement, and I believe it's true. But if it is true, and I think it is, then logic tells us that it is counter to the idea that we should restore streams and habitat to some stable state, or what we called back in the 80s equilibrium state, because we acknowledge that there's this equilibrium, but there's variation around that, and that's all cool, so we'll just give it that buzzword. What we were really doing is we were trying to lock the channel into a given condition. That, if what Ellen is telling us is correct, then that is counter to what we were doing back then. And if that's true, then logic tells us that the spatial and temporal variability facilitates, get this, the biological and species diversity and resilience. Oh, wow. What do I mean by that? If you have spatial and temporal variability in your habitat, that leads to variability and diversity in your species. You'll have many life history characteristics. We need to maintain that. There are certain life history characteristics today that actually have a higher survival rate as they go down through the Columbia River out to the estuary and come back. But those conditions may change over time. And if we're only focusing on those life history characteristics that have the highest survival rate today, we may not be able to manage for changes in the future. So we need to maintain habitat diversity at different spatial and temporal scales, because I believe that leads to this variability in life history characteristics, and it also leads to biodiversity, and it leads to resilience. That, I think, is the heart of what we're trying to accomplish in this two-day conference. And although some of you are looking forward to what's going to happen later this evening, I want you to really focus on the talks, because there are some wonderful talks that are going to be given today. And in those talks, and this means I'm supposed to shut up, in those talks, we're going to hear about a lot of the things that we've just talked about. So I challenge you to listen carefully and take good notes, and then ask lots of good questions. So that's all I'm going to say at this point. Thanks to everybody for being here, and that's what you get for asking me to do this on short notice.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Tracy and Shannon, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming here today. I just have a few quick announcements before I announce our first speaker. Bathrooms are located just outside these doors, just behind some of the exhibitor booths to the left when you walk down the hallway. Each session today will include multiple presenters, about 3 to 5 generally. Time allowing, speakers may take questions between talks. I or another timekeeper will be sitting right here. If you're a speaker, you can kind of check on how much time you have left if there's time for talks. However, there will be a separate 15 or 30-minute Q&A session at the end of each session. So if everyone wants to hold their questions till the end, and speakers can come back up here and then take questions from those previous talks. So don't worry if there isn't time after a talk. There are pens and notepads at each of your table to take note of those questions throughout each session as well. If you have questions, please walk up to the standing mic in the middle here. You can form a queue or, race to it, whatever your heart desires. If you have any mobility issues, we will have 1 to 2 mic runners, so just raise your hand and we can bring a mic to you to answer or to ask your question as well. A note to presenters, when there are 5 minutes left, you will see this sign. I will be sitting here for the first little bit, so you'll see me hold up this sign. And when you have 1 minute left, you will see this sign. This is the sign to wrap things up, or I will walk up onto this stage and force you to wrap up. Thank you again for everyone being here, and I guess with that, I will introduce our first session, which is Species Survival and Life History. And our first speaker is Mike Ford from NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and he will be talking about the status of ESA-listed salmon and steelhead in the Upper Columbia, seen from a coastwide perspective.
I'm in the middle. Let's get back to the beginning. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I think I was here 4 years ago, right before the COVID thing hit, so it's fun to be back. I'm with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and I've been involved in ESA's salmon status reviews for like 20 years now. And I'll be talking a little bit about both ESA status of the listed salmon and steelhead species in the Upper Columbia, and then putting that into the context of status coastwide. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of people contributed to the information in this talk, both at NIMFS and throughout the coast, including here in this room. I do want to make sure that I acknowledge that any weird conclusions or errors are my own, however. So my main goals for this talk are really just to do a brief summary of the most recent 5-year status review update for listed Upper Columbia River Spring Chinook and steelhead, and then put that into this coastwide perspective. So this is in terms of the scale, a big picture scale, and then maybe start to try to take stock a little bit about kind of how things are going after basically 25 years, a quarter century of ESA listings of salmon along the Pacific coast. So when we talk about salmon status reviews, there's really two sorts of information that go into these. There's the biological information related to the species, to the fish, and these are summarized in the 4 VSP parameters: abundance, productivity, spatial structure, and diversity. And then there are also the 5 statutory listing factors in the Endangered Species Act, which are basically categories of threat, and these would include habitat loss, low survival due to overutilization, climate change, hatcheries, and so forth. So the status review does both of those things, and at the end of that, you end up just putting the species into 3 categories: either endangered, which means high risk of extinction kind of right now, threatened, which is trending towards being at a high risk of extinction in the future, or not warranted for listing, which is either low risk or maybe just not being assessed. And so within the agency, those 2 types of things are typically broken down and done in kind of 2 different stages. The science centers typically do the viability update, the focus on the biological attributes of the fish. And so a few years ago, 2002, we published an update of that for all the listed species in the Pacific Northwest. And then the NIMFS regional office, West Coast regional office, takes that information and also looks at the listing factors and wraps that into a formal status review update. And the one for the Upper Columbia was just published also at the same time in 2022. So just kind of running through these VSP criteria quickly for the 2 listed species that we're in charge of up here, not looking at bull trout or other ones. Upper Columbia Spring Chinook, listed in 1999. 3 extant populations, the Wenatchee, Entiat, and Methow watersheds, focusing first on abundance. There's an abundance trend of natural spawners in these rivers from the naturally spawning population from 1980 to about 2022. So this includes both natural origin fish as well as hatchery origin fish on the natural spawning grounds that are supplementing these populations or straying into them. The black line is the total spawning population, including both hatchery and natural fish, and the red line is just for the natural origin fish. The horizontal blue line is an approximation of the recovery goal, abundance recovery goal, and the recovery plan for these populations. And at first glance, you can kind of see that things are maybe not horrible. All populations have increased in total abundance, total natural spawning abundance, since the time they were listed in the late 1990s, and have exceeded that goal in terms of total abundance in some years. The sort of bad news is that that goal is in terms of natural origin abundance, so the focus is on that red line, which for all three populations remains well below the recovery goals. There's lots of different ways of measuring productivity. We use a really simple measure in the status review updates, which is just the log of the natural origin recruits to the natural spawning population that produced those recruits. That would include both natural fish, natural origin fish, and the supplementation fish. And the goal here is just to ask if the population is capable of growing based on natural production alone. So positive values here are good, negative values are not so good. You can see that all three populations have had at least a period of positive population growth that kind of occurred soon after the listings. But in general, most of these values are negative, indicating that the population's not sort of demonstrating an ability to be naturally self-sustaining. And this is both due to sort of a lack of sufficient natural origin recruits, and also the fact that this denominator contains a fair number of naturally spawning hatchery fish in it. So speaking of that, the next thing I'd like to talk about is measures of diversity, which again, there are a number of measures of diversity in the recovery plan. One of the ones that has been a problem and is limiting recovery of these populations is the proportion of the population that consists of natural origin spawners. So that's what this is showing here. So the approximate recovery goal is it's a little bit complicated, but I think it can be simplified as basically saying you want to have roughly 90% or higher natural origin fish in the population over time. So you can see that, at least for the Entiat, we're approaching that goal. For the other two more supplemented populations, we're well short of that goal, although trends are largely in a positive direction. So the overall conclusion in terms of viability in this last status review update is that all three populations remain at high risk of extinction, and therefore the ESU remains at high risk of extinction. This is largely driven by problems in really all four of the VSP parameters, with the exception maybe of spatial structure. These numbers are a couple of years old, and there's been a little bit of an uptick in recent years, so they might be a little bit better now, but this is still basically the result. So running through the same data briefly for steelhead, here's the same sort of figure of abundance. There's one additional extant population in the Okanagan, and these are more, especially in the recent past, more heavily supplemented populations with high proportions of hatchery fish on the spawning grounds. So total abundance was pretty high, but natural origin abundance in some years is approaching the recovery goal. So abundance is not totally the issue here. On the other hand, productivity, as at least measured in this way, is uniformly low, and this really just reflects the fact that the natural spawning population, when you include the supplementation fish, is pretty high, but the recruitment is pretty low, resulting in low natural origin spawner ratios. You can see there's a bit of a trend towards more equal numbers of hatchery and natural fish over time, which might result in some improvement to this productivity statistic in coming years. So here's the proportion of natural origin fish in the spawning grounds, and you can see generally improving trends, although some still pretty low values for a couple of the populations, maybe starting to approach the recovery goals in a couple of them as well. But the overall conclusion in the 2022 update is still that the DPS is at high risk of extinction, again due to problems really in most of the VSP criteria. So now I'm going to turn briefly to the listing factor conclusions. And really, each of these could be a talk in themselves. And of course, later in this conference, there are many talks on each of these factors. So I'm not going to go into any detail here, but really I'm just going to give kind of the bottom line conclusions as they're stated in this 2022 status update. So for factor A, which is habitat degradation, the kind of bottom line is there's been lots of efforts at habitat improvement. And of course, people in this room are responsible for that. Significant amount of work and money spent. Overall, however, the review concludes that habitat remains, even if it has improved, remains degraded compared to what it needs to be, but also concludes that there are continued opportunities for improvement. Overutilization has not been a huge issue for these ESUs, at least over the last couple decades. Ocean harvest is negligible, freshwater impacts are pretty limited. Scientific take occurs, but is not considered to be a real significant factor. So this is currently not considered to be a huge problem for these particular ESUs. Predation is a well-known problem for both. Bird and fish predation has been studied for years and has remained perhaps relatively constant. Pinniped predation is a growing concern, both in terms of a growing awareness of the problem and since the time of listing, given increasing pinniped abundance, also probably an increasing threat to especially the Spring Chinook population. I don't have a lot to say about regulatory mechanisms other than there's a lot of them and not a lot of change from past reviews. Factor E is this catch-all of other risks, and for us, the two that are kind of most prominent are climate change and hatcheries. Climate change has definitely gotten worse since the time of listing, an increasing threat, and also an increasing awareness of that threat. Looking at future projections, particularly for ocean conditions, and it's potentially an existential threat for these populations, and both of these species are highly vulnerable to predicted future climate change. Hatcheries are a threat that has actually been evaluated to have improved over the years. Generally, as I showed before, lower proportion of hatchery fish on the spawning ground, improved hatchery practices, and somewhat reduced releases all have made hatcheries probably less of an issue than they were in the past. So the kind of overall summary for these two ESUs is honestly pretty much the same as it was when I gave a similar talk 4 years ago. I think we can say that status has improved since the time of listing. I think they're at lower risk of extinction, at least in the near term now, than they were at that really low point then. We have improved abundance. We have some improved trends in diversity. There's been a lot of work done to try to make things better for these ESUs. On the other hand, both ESUs are still really far from their recovery goals, and there are some sort of major increasing threats on the horizon, particularly from climate change. So now I want to turn to the second part of this talk, which is to basically put that into the status of other ESUs, other listed and unlisted ESUs of salmon and steelhead coastwide. So one just brief reminder, none of these species are listed at the species level. So there are no Pacific salmon species that are considered to be endangered or threatened when considered at the level of the whole species. All of them are listed at a level of a distinct population segment, which is a portion of a species. And just by reminder, this is done for salmon under the NIMS ESU policy, which says that for Pacific salmon, a population or a group of populations will be a DPS if it's ESU, which is a group of populations that are reproductively isolated from other groups and are an important component of the evolutionary diversity of the entire species. And then also just a reminder that hatchery fish are included in the listed species if they're similar to the wild fish. So over the last 30 years, there have been 51 ESUs or DPSs identified for salmon and steelhead along the West Coast. A little more than half of them are ESA listed, mostly as threatened. And these, I won't read all these numbers, but just occur across all of the biological species except for pink salmon. In terms of a timeline, the first listings were in 1989, the last was in 2007, starting with Sacramento winter run Chinook in California, the last being Puget Sound steelhead here in Washington. Most of the listings occurred between 1999 and 2002 as the result of the NIMS coastwide status reviews. It is worth remembering that although there's a lot of listed salmon, there are also a lot of unlisted ESUs, so a little less than half of the identified ESUs are unlisted, and they occur across all the different species. I don't have a lot to say about this other than most of them, but not all, are coastal. There are some unlisted, of course, in this region. And then I also wanted to note that 4 of these actually are currently undergoing ESA status reviews based on recent listing petitions. So what I wanted to talk about next was just some sort of general trends in abundance and in proportion hatchery spawners or proportion natural spawners across these ESUs coastwide, starting with Chinook. And I say Spring Chinook here, that's wrong. I meant to just say Chinook. And so here are 13 ESUs of Chinook salmon, both listed and unlisted. I have the Upper Columbia Spring Run boxed off there. And what I'm showing here is just the trends in the natural spawning population from 1990 to 2020. And the little gray lines are each individual population within the ESU. The red line is the average population size, spawning population size within the ESU, and then the gold line is the summed population size, so the total ESU abundance. And note the log scale. And so the main sort of point I wanted to make here was, one, there is some diversity in kind of typical size among these ESUs. The Upper Columbia Spring Chinook are among the smallest of the least abundant of the ESUs coastwide for Chinook salmon. But then the other point I wanted to make is that most of these have pretty flat trends, and I'll get into this a little more in a moment. But with the exception of Snake River Falls Chinook, which has a notably increasing trend, everything else is pretty much flat over time when looked at as an average or a sum. There's, of course, lots of variation of the individual populations. Here's the same data for steelhead, looking at nine ESUs, plotted in the same way. A little more diversity and trend, I would say, with a few having declining trends, particularly Olympic Peninsula, Puget Sound, Southwest Washington, maybe some increasing trends in Northern California. But again, nothing really dramatic or obvious in these trends. We can look at this for all of these ESUs. This isn't quite all 51, but it's most of them, divided up into the different species. So this is the 30-year trend from 1990 to 2020. The big dot with the confidence interval is the average trend for the average or sum of the total ESU, focusing on the natural spawning population, which can include naturally spawning hatchery fish. And then each individual dot are the individual populations within that ESU. And the kind of main observation that I want to get from this are that most of the trends are pretty flat. There are some exceptions. There are some significantly positive, a few significantly negative, but most of these trends are pretty flat. A couple things to note, both of the listed chum ESUs have positive trends. You can see the Snake River Falls Chinook has a positive trend. And of the significant positive trends, 6 of the 8 of those significant trends are listed ESUs. Turning briefly to natural origin spawners, and again, this should be just Chinook, not Spring Chinook. These are fairly quirky data, and some of the areas don't have a lot of data at all, so don't look at this too carefully. I guess the main point is that there's a lot of variance among ESUs on kind of the degree of hatchery influence. Upper Columbia Spring Chinook are among the more hatchery influenced of these ESUs, and then some declining trends in the case of like Puget Sound Chinook salmon. Here's the same data for steelhead. And again, I guess the main point that I want to make here is, once again, the Upper Columbia steelhead have kind of a relatively low proportion of natural origin spawners compared to some of the other steelhead DPSs. So I think in a way, the kind of bottom line is that not a lot has changed in terms of this overall status or abundance over the last 30 or so years. And the question that I think is interesting to ask is that sort of good or bad news? And I think you could come up with reasons to argue either way. And so I'll just kind of go over those quickly. So on the one hand, there have been a lot of negative pressures that have probably increased over those 30 years. So these include things like increasing human populations in the states of Washington, Oregon, and California, known increases in habitat degradation. So there's just one example from Puget Sound, but there's lots of others that have documented increasing habitat loss and degradation over the last 30 years. As I mentioned, climate change has both, been a potential problem over this last 30 years and is expected to be a potentially huge problem into the future. Here's a figure from a recent paper by Lisa Crozier et al. That predicts that if the relationship between interior Columbia, Spring Chinook, salmon survival and ocean temperatures remain as it has been in the past into the future, the predicted climate effects influencing that parameter could be really catastrophic for these populations. And then, of course, increasing predators. So here's a figure as an example from a recent paper by Brandon Chasko et al. That estimated that dramatic increases in consumption of Chinook salmon from marine mammals over the last, in this case, 40 years or so, again, due to increases in the abundance of these populations over that time period. So all those are reasons to think that things have gotten worse over the last 30 or so years for these populations. So maybe it's sort of good news that they are holding their own. Some of the positive pressures that might be allowing them to hold their own are the fact that these are, for the most part, managed populations. So you can see in the same figure that human take of these species in fisheries has gone down, in part to make up for the increasing take by marine mammals. And in general, the harvest management regime is trying to maintain these constant escapements. So maybe it's not too surprising that is the case over the last 30 years as harvest responds to lower abundance. As I mentioned, there have been a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on habitat restoration, lots of changes to the hydro system in the Columbia, dam removal in tributaries and other parts of the coast, all of which should be a good thing for salmon. And then hatchery improvements. So here's a figure from a recent report by WDFW, Andrew Murdoch, kind of documenting, not perfect, but lots of improvement in the hatchery system over this time period. You can see this in the data in some cases. So I showed you some examples from the Upper Columbia. Here's an example from the Oregon coast with sort of market improvements in the proportion of natural origin spawners across the board in the case of Oregon coast coho salmon. So those are some things that have helped and that are probably helping over the same time period. So just in kind of final summary, there have been these pretty big ecosystem changes over the last 25 years. Problems, negative pressures from climate, predators, development, positive pressures from restoration activities and other changes in management. Not much change in coastwide salmon spawning abundance or status. In fact, very little change. So this could be seen as bad news and that recovery still seems to be a very long way off, and particularly in the case of climate, there's likely worse to come. Or maybe you could see it as good news that salmon are holding their own in the face of these increasing challenges and that some of our actions are helping with this. So I'm going to leave it at that. I know a lot of other talks are going to get into a lot of detail on these topics, so I'm really looking forward to hearing those and learning a lot more about that. Thank you. Okay. I guess we have time for one or two questions if there are any. I probably didn't say anything that anyone doesn't already know. So.
All right, thank you, Mike. Moving on to our next presenter, we have Mark Sorel from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he will be speaking on the population level considerations of Spring Chinook life history diversity.
All right, thank you very much. That was a great talk by Mike. Really set the stage well, I think, for the day. So I'm happy to be following that. My name is Mark Sorel. I'm a research scientist at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. But today I'm going to be talking about some work that I did as a PhD student at University of Washington. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge my co-authors listed here who were instrumental in this work. Also want to acknowledge a lot of different entities provided data that I analyzed, and I was supported through funding from a few different entities in doing the research. So I want to start off with a paper that came out in 2013 looking at Snake River spring summer Chinook salmon, which are listed as threatened. And this paper looked at the production of juveniles as a function of adult abundance and found evidence of negative density dependence, which means that you get fewer juveniles per spawner as you get more spawners. And I think they called that the density dilemma because it suggests that you're running up against some sort of habitat limitation or carrying capacity, even though you're at low abundance, you're threatened. So moving on to another paper that came out the next year, also looking at Snake River spring summer Chinook salmon. This one introduces the concept of juvenile life history diversity and migration tactics. And by that, they mean that we know that some spring Chinook will stay really close to where they were spawned for their entire freshwater rearing period, which is over a year, and others will move downstream and take up residence somewhere lower in the watershed for some time before going to the ocean. And this plot here actually shows the relationship between, across different populations and years, the total number of fish that came back and the proportion of those that they estimated exhibited one of these downstream rearing life history tactics. And you can see a positive relationship. And so this seems related to the previous work on this density dilemma because it suggests that in order to achieve these bigger population sizes, these populations might need to take advantage of some downstream rearing habitat to kind of increase the capacity to support them. So, given these papers from the Snake River, I was interested in taking a look at some of the monitoring data from the Upper Columbia and seeing if we saw similar patterns of density dependence and juvenile production for Upper Columbia populations. And so then wanted to take that to the next step and look at how different juvenile life history pathways were contributing to adult returns and see if we could use that to maybe provide some information that could be useful to inform habitat management. All right, so the case study that I'm going to be talking about is Wenatchee Spring Chinook, one of the three extant major population groups in the ESU. The orange habitat here is where spring Chinook spawn primarily in the Wenatchee, and the three blue triangles in the upper part of the watershed are downstream migrant traps that capture juveniles when they're moving downstream. And so we get information from those traps on the abundance of juveniles that are produced and when they're leaving the natal stream. So let me show you a little bit of data from these downstream migrant traps. The plot on the left is a frequency histogram of the day of year that fish are caught in those three traps. And we see three modes of outmigration. One in the spring, a more protracted mode in the summer, and then another mode in the fall. The plot on the right has day of year on the X and length on the Y. The gray points are all fish that are captured. The purple points are fish that are pit tagged and then detected at McNary Dam or further downstream in the same year that they were tagged. And the green points are fish that were detected at McNary Dam or downstream the next calendar year after they were tagged. So from this plot, we see that that spring outmigration is composed of two different age classes. You've got fish that are leaving as age zeros at 50 millimeters about or smaller, and also at that same time fish that are leaving age ones, quite a bit bigger, moving straight to the ocean. And then during summer and fall, you have age zeros primarily that are leaving, and those fish are, we don't really know how far they're going, but we know that they're not passing McNary Dam until the following year. So the next question was, okay, how does the abundance of fish expressing these different juvenile life history pathways in individual years relate to the density of spawners? Again, looking for density dependence. So that's what I'm showing here on this plot. It's got spawner density on the x-axis and juvenile abundance on the y-axis. The three different columns are the three different screw traps for natal streams, and the four different rows are those four different juvenile life history pathways, where the top one is the fish that are leaving the soonest at that really young age, then the fish are leaving during summer age zeros, then fall as age zeros, and then the spring yearlings. And what we see is that for those two life history pathways that are leaving the soonest, there isn't really any evidence of this negative density dependence. But then as we get into the fish that are leaving in the fall and as spring yearlings, we do see evidence of negative density dependence. So, you know, it's hard to really say too much about what the mechanisms are that are causing this pattern, but it suggests that maybe there's some limitation in the natal stream that occurs during the summer. Okay, and it also means that as you have more spawners, a higher proportion of your total emigrants are going to be fish that are leaving earlier, right? Because there's a limitation for the older emigrants, but less so for the younger emigrants. So that's the juveniles, but really what we want to know is how much are those different life history pathways contributing to adults coming back? There's at least two different ways that you can get at this. One would be to take the adults that came back and reconstruct their juvenile life histories using something like an otolith, and we'll hear a talk on that shortly. But the approach that we took was to take the abundance of juveniles and multiply that times their survival rates to adulthood based on pit tags. So that's what we did and constructed a life cycle model built around that data, and then used it to project the population and look at its characteristics and how these different life history pathways were contributing to adult returns. So here's the results from projections. The plot on the left is showing the average abundance in 50-year projections, and the plot on the right is showing the proportion of returning adults that we estimated had exhibited different juvenile life history pathways. And so, you know, the abundance of, this is natural origin spawners only, is hovering around 250, and about 60% of the returning adults we estimated had done the life history pathway where they stayed in the natal stream all the way until going to the ocean as smolts. So the last thing I'm going to show is we then said, okay, well, let's play around with this. This is a model, so we can do this. Let's crank up survival of these different life history pathways to reflect habitat restoration and see what that does to the population abundance and the contribution of the different life history pathways. So we weren't able to actually connect real habitat actions to demographic responses, but we did these hypotheses that if a habitat was restored, well, first off, we had 4 different restoration strategies. One is the baseline, another is restoring the natal stream, then restoring the downstream habitat, and then finally restoring both natal stream and downstream habitat. And we hypothesized that for each of these strategies, there was 3 life stages that could respond: egg to fry survival, fry to par, and par to smolt. And each one would receive a 10% increase in survival if it was present in that habitat during that life stage. Okay, so if natal streams were restored, all life history pathways get a 10% benefit for egg to fry, but fish that leave during summer aren't going to get a full benefit for fry to par. Okay, so those were the things that we simulated, and these are the results. So I guess I thought there was a chance that the downstream restoration would have a big benefit because of the fish that are moving downstream don't seem to be as limited by carrying capacity, but we did see the biggest response to the natal stream restoration, and that was probably because there was a benefit for all life history pathways, and an especially big benefit for the life history pathways, which remain to be contributing the most to the population, and that's the fish that are staying in the natal stream until spring of their second year of life, and the fish that are staying until fall. So a little, counterintuitive, but an increase in abundance and a little change in the contribution of life history pathways. You are seeing more contribution of the downstream marine life history pathways, especially the summer life history pathway, which is the least affected by density dependence, but not a huge change. So in conclusion, natal stream habitat obviously is important, and the life history pathways that are rearing entirely in the natal stream seem to be kind of a core life history pathway for these populations. But we do know that as populations get bigger, they do tend to disperse downstream to a greater degree. So that suggests that that downstream habitat is important. If we're able to reach larger population sizes, then it could become more important. And so thinking about kind of next steps and implications of this work, for me personally, one of the things I'm curious about is kind of more details about where the fish go once they leave the natal stream, how far are they going, and then if you could compare survival in the natal stream and downstream habitats during a common time, during a common life stage, that would seem really valuable. That's not something we did because we didn't look at survival before fish got to the natal stream or before they got to the screw trap. And then thinking about the simulations of habitat, probably the least satisfying thing was just having to hypothesize what the benefits would be of restoration. And obviously it would be better to have a more mechanistic connection between the habitat and the restoration opportunities, I guess, in different habitats, and then the demographic responses. So I think tomorrow we're going to hear a talk about some HARP modeling being developed for the Upper Columbia, and I'm hopeful that that will represent that next step in this kind of modeling. So that's what I've got. Thank you very much, and hope it was useful. Okay. Yeah, I guess we've got time for a few questions, or we can take them at the end. Thank you.
All right, we're a couple minutes ahead of schedule, so I'll just give everyone a second to maybe refill their coffee mugs or anything like that. All right, if everyone can find their seat again, we're going to move on to the next speaker in just a minute here. All right, thank you. Next up, we have Kevin C. from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he will be speaking on the pre-spawn mortality in Upper Columbia Spring Chinook across a habitat gradient.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I think this is great. Mark set up a great talk talking about Spring Chinook juveniles, and I think this is going to follow, focusing more on Spring Chinook adults in the Upper Columbia. So first, I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors. Did a lot of work to make this happen. Talk a little bit about the motivation behind this work. Primary motivation is to work towards more accurate estimates of wild Spring Chinook at multiple spatial scales. So both at the ESU, but also at the population scale, and then getting down to the major spawning tributary scale as well. With the focus for this talk and kind of the results we're looking at the moment, looking at abundance measures, looking at estimates of the proportion of hatchery and natural origin spawners, and calculating at least a coarse measure of pre-spawn survival, and taking a look at all of those across those different spatial scales. I'd also like to thank the funding sources for this. That's also always appreciated. All right, so what we looked at here in terms of the methods we were taking started with estimating run escapement. And by run escapement, I mean an estimate of adults coming into some spatial area, population, tributary, as they enter, but before they spawn, right? So these Spring Chinook, they may be entering a tributary and holding for a month, 2 months, maybe a little more. But so that initial stage before spawning is what I'm talking about by run escapement. So to estimate that, we started with fish crossing Priest Rapids Dam, shown here. And some proportion of those that climbed the ladder had the lucky fate of falling into trap there, where they're measured for length, they're sexed, origin is determined, and probably the most important bit for this project, they are pit tagged. Those pit tags are then detected across this network of sites all over the Upper Columbia. You can see all the little black dots represent a site there. We use those detections in a mark recapture model to estimate the probability of moving from Priest Rapids to any of those particular detection points, while accounting for the fact that none of those have perfect detection. So you're estimating detection probability as well as movement. And we've been doing that for steelhead in this area for a long time. Started with Spring Chinook, so this work has included results from 2022 and 2023, so just a couple years so far. In order to translate those movement rates into abundance numbers, we need an estimate of abundance so at one of those detection sites somewhere, in particular for Spring Chinook. And so we focused on estimating abundance at Priest Rapids. And there are a couple challenges that come with that. The initial data that goes into that estimate, I suppose, would be the window counts at the dam. There's a couple, like I said, a couple challenges or adjustments to be made to those. The first would be adjusting for fallback and reascension, so fish that may be crossing the dam more than once and therefore counted at the window more than once. So we used previously pit-tagged fish to kind of estimate how many of those are detected moving up the ladder more than once and estimate that reascension rate and adjust the counts for that. The other one is the fact that those counts include Chinook as a whole, and we wanted to decompose that into springs and summers. And so again, we use data from the trap to look at the proportion each week of how many proportion of Spring Chinook versus summer Chinook, and you can see on this graph how that proportion changed through time. And you can see the 2 different years. You can see it kind of follows a pretty straightforward curve each year. Somewhere around the beginning of June, it starts to drop from 100% down to, by the end of June, it's pretty much all summer Chinook. But there is some year-to-year variability. The dashed line there is June 13th which I believe is the accepted cutoff for usually the counts before that are considered spring Chinooks, the counts after are considered summer Chinooks. You can see it's probably long term, that's probably maybe an appropriate date, but there's a lot of some year-to-year variability. So we were able to decompose that a little more, I'd say a little more accurately for those 2 years. And translating those, the proportion of springs plus the counts plus the reascension rates, you can look at estimates of the total number of spring Chinook crossing Priest Rapids through time. Again, you can see there's definitely some differences in run timing between the 2 years, probably due to various conditions. Add those all up, you can translate that into an estimate of total spring Chinook crossing Priest Rapids, multiply that by your movement rates that we've estimated, and now we have estimates of run escapement to any of those detection locations across the Upper Columbia. The other bit of data that we were interested in, oh, I should point out before I go on, we ran this movement model for both all fish, all spring Chinook, and generally decomposed into your movement rates can be different for hatchery fish and wild fish, because presumably they may be going to different places. But you can use all of those tags to help estimate the detection probability. So we ran it for all the tags, and then we also ran it for female only, so that you can get an estimate of just females moving into each of those areas. In part because the other bit of information that we wanted to bring into this analysis were the number of female spawners, which in this case we assumed that the red counts, so observed reds, were equal to the number of female spawners. Assumption that every female builds one red. And in particular, you can see on this map some of the major spawning tributaries that we were looking at. So there were a few in the Wenatchee, the Entiat almost as a whole, a few in the Methow, and a couple in the Okanagan as well. What we wanted to do, in particular looking at pre-spawn survival or pre-spawn mortality, kind of comparing the run escapement to each of these tributaries. You can see the red dots represent a pit tag detection site. So you can look at the run escapement past that point, compare it with the red counts upstream of that point, and kind of estimate your pre-spawn survival based on those numbers. All right, looking at a few of the different results, we'll start large scale abundance, comparing estimates of abundance based on this pit tag movement model. So those are the triangles here with accepted dam counts at some of the main dams in the Upper Columbia. You can see in general they match up quite well across both years. There's a little variability there. Priest Rapids and Rock Island estimates differ from the counts by 1 to 2%, probably accounted for by that reascension bit that I mentioned. Since those dam counts don't account for that, you'd expect the counts to be a little bit higher than our estimates. The estimates at Rocky Reach and Wells differ by closer to 10%. Obviously, the numbers are lower, so the percentage is bigger. And that may have something to do with run timing and the dates that are chosen to tally up what counts as spring Chinook counts at those dams. Again, sticking with sort of an ESU level spatial scale, looking at the proportion of hatchery versus natural origin fish. Plots like this, you can see a proportion of hatchery. The purple is hatchery fish, the yellow would be natural origin fish. The inner circle there represents 2022, the outer circle represents 2023. So you can see there's a little difference year to year, but generally most of the fish moving into this ESU are hatchery fish. You can then break that down a little bit smaller scale, looking at the population scale. You can see the Wenatchee and the Methow certainly have a lot of hatchery fish, but a significant chunk of wild fish. The Entiat, mostly wild fish, although not an insignificant proportion of hatchery fish, indicating there's definitely some hatchery strain into the Entiat. And the Okanagan, which did have very low abundance, what we'll look at in a second, was pretty much almost all hatchery fish, the few tags that were observed moving in there. So looking at results for abundance, this is wild spring Chinook escapement to each of these populations. And you can see biggest numbers in the Wenatchee, followed by the Methow and the Entiat. As I mentioned, a handful of fish moving into the Okanagan. We detected literally just probably less than 5 tags in the entire system there. Moving into a slightly smaller spatial scale, looking at the major spawning tributaries. Again, going back to proportion of hatchery or natural origin. Didn't put all of the spawning tributaries on this slide, but just as an example, within the Wenatchee, you can see Nason, kind of way over on the left, is mostly hatchery, and the Chihuahua is mostly wild, just for some contrast there. Whereas in the Methow, the Twisp is mostly wild, whereas the upper Methow and the Chinook, predominantly hatchery, although clearly in all of those systems there's a significant chunk of natural origin fish. In the Okanagan, one of those, the Omak, again, small number of tags, but pretty much all of them were hatchery. All right, so looking at wild abundance at that tributary scale, this is again looking at total wild spring Chinook escapement. So there's a few different spatial scales going. Most of these are actual tributaries. There's a couple, like at Tumwater, which is a combination of the upper tributaries in the Wenatchee, plus a couple main stem reaches. So kind of encompasses all of that. Same, there's a point on here for the Methow spawning tribs, which is essentially adding up those 3 major spawning areas in the Methow. We're going to look at it at that scale. Again, you can see Chihuahua and Nason are the biggest abundance across both years, followed by some of the spots in the Methow, the Twisp and the Chinook. And again, all of the spawning tributaries in the Okanagan, very low. The Entiat has, some number of fish for sure. You could also look at the total female spring Chinook escapement. So this includes wild and hatchery females, but just looking at, or this is generated just from females tagged at Priest Rapids. Similar patterns, although a little different, but still most of the females, certainly in the Wenatchee, are moving into the Chihuahua and Nason. And then similarly in the Methow, the Chinook and the Twisp are the big recipients. And again, not as many moving into the Entiat. Taking these results, so the total female abundance and the red counts in many of these spawning tributaries, calculated pre-spawn survival. So presumably, if that escapement was equal to the number of reds, then your pre-spawn survival would be close to 1 along that upper dashed line. And there were a few spawning tributaries close to that. There were a few you can see are above 1, indicating that the number of reds was greater than the number of fish that we estimated to escape there, number of females we estimated to escape. There's a lot of uncertainty in a lot of these estimates, and so especially for those, obviously the pre-spawn survival isn't greater than 1, but I'd say it's probably pretty high in those areas. The uncertainty around a lot of these estimates is driven primarily by the number of pit tags you observe moving into each of those areas. So, we can only tag so many fish, you only get so many detections in each of these tributaries. The fewer detections, the more uncertainty in your female escapement estimates. So places like the White River, the Little Wenatchee, very few tags detected moving in there, so there's more uncertainty there. However, so looking at this, even though there's lots of uncertainty, and it's this is probably the coarsest or the finest spatial scale we might be able to look at using these methods to estimate pre-spawn survival, it was still lower in a lot of places than I was hoping for. Across the Wenatchee, you see estimates in the 50 to 60% range, indicating these females have gotten all the way into the spawning tributary, and somewhere in the month or 2 that they're holding, nearly half of them are dying before they have a chance to spawn. Clearly that's, the picture could be a little different across different areas, but you see most of the spots where the uncertainty is the smallest, so our most precise estimates, it's hovering close to that 50% range. In the Okanagan, very few reds were counted, so that pre-spawn survival looks like it's nearly 0, which maybe is not surprising. The Okanagan wasn't necessarily a spring Chinook population, habitat-wise. thinking about where to go from here. So we'd like to start comparing some of these results, especially the proportion of hatchery natural origin spawners, with current methods, which generally come from carcass recoveries right on the spawning grounds. Other research that we've been working on shows there may be some bias in that kind of method, so I'd be curious how these two match up. They're also operating on slightly different life history stages, right? The proportions that we're estimating with this are on that run escapement life history stage, so pre-spawning, versus carcasses. Some of them may be recovered from if they die before spawning, but many of them may be recovered after spawning, so it might be slightly different. We are planning to conduct one more year of pit tagging at Priest Rapids, and so we'll have one more year of data to add to this entire data set and look at. But in part, I think, even though there's a lot of uncertainty in those pre-spawn survival estimates, there's enough of a signal there to indicate that pre-spawn mortality may be an issue in a lot of spots across the Upper Columbia, and we'd like to shift to a study design that's a little more focused on that, possibly using radio tags so that you can track individual fish, look at exactly where they may be holding, where they may be surviving, and where they may be dying, and hopefully tie that to more specific habitat characteristics and try to tease out more of that story. And I think I'm out of time. Thanks.
There will be time for questions during the Q&A here in another 15 minutes or so. But next up, we have Christopher Johnson from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. His talk is on the environmental factors influencing Chinook salmon egg-to-fry survival in 4 Columbia River tributaries.
All right, well, thank you for having me today. Some really good talks so far, so hopefully this doesn't disappoint. So I'm going to give a brief overview of a study I've been involved with for a number of years now, looking at spring Chinook egg-to-fry survival across the upper and middle Columbia. Just quickly to acknowledge my co-authors. So Phil Roney with Kramer Fish Sciences, formerly from NOAA Fisheries, had the idea for this study way back in 2008. And secured funding for this. And then Trenton DeBoer with the Yakima Nation now is largely responsible for overseeing a good deal of the data collection that I'll be providing today. And then Tom Quinn with the University of Washington, who's actually my graduate advisor, has been helping me put this together, hopefully for publication soon. Okay, back in 2008, we had these initial project objectives to create a standardized method to estimate egg-to-fry survival that we could use over larger spatial scales. And so we did this in the Yakima Basin and then looked at survival in relation to some of the key physical variables like scour and fines. And so we wrote up the methodology in 2012 and then had a second paper in 2016 that looked at interannual variance in the Yakima Basin. But the long-term objectives were always to increase the scope of this, to look at survival over multiple populations and multiple basins, to improve those estimates where we could, and then use that larger data set to develop predictive models that would be useful for life cycle modeling efforts. And then where we could, knowing this is an environmental study, try to look at potential confounds where we could look at causal relationships as well. And I want to note the funding for this was initially largely through NOAA Fisheries, but also Bonneville Power Administration, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Douglas County PUD. So the study area, 4 basic basins, so the Wenatchee Basin, the Yakima, Medow, and the Entiat. So all told, it was generally 3 years behind each of these basins, data collected between 2009 and 2021. All told, 130 study sites that are noted by the circles here. Each of these representing multiple years and multiple replicates. And so all told, we ended up with 1,148 replicates across the design that we could look at for the analysis. So I'm going to go through just a couple of method slides quickly. I'll refer you to our first publication for more information on this because there's a lot more to it. But generally, we used these Whitlock Vibrant egg boxes. And they have several advantages. So the one disadvantage is that you have to make the assumption that an egg box is representative of an egg pocket. However, if you can do that, then these allow for much greater replication. And then we're not disturbing natural reds. You have a known number of eggs, known parentage, so we can look at that. And then these particular boxes have been used for sedimentation studies just by themselves. And so we end up with a really good estimate of percent fines as well. So we modified them slightly, some additional screening to prevent fry from escaping, and there's a tray here that you can't see real well on the top that was removed as well. So our study sites were approximately 2 kilometers apart. Just in general, this is the Nason Creek in Wenatchee for an example. The blue dots there are spawning distribution over about a 10-year period, and the red dots are sites. So we focused in on areas where we had moderately high spawning densities, so we'd have some higher probability of having spawners in each year. And so the egg box there on the left kind of shows you what it looks like before it goes in the gravel. And then we would excavate out to 30 centimeters, which is just an average for Spring Chinook. Place the boxes then in this bottomless bucket, backfill, remove the bucket, and some morphological digging around to make it look like a red for the most part, and that's our artificial red. So then we also had scour chains behind each of these. We looked at temperature on site. We did Woolman counts, which gave us substrate size and embeddedness. Then we followed up with observational visits where we could look at things like superimposition. And then these were recovered between 900 and 1,000 accumulated thermal units. And then we would just count fry and retain all the fines as well. So we define fines as particles that are less than 2 millimeters in size. So in the end, we ended up with 13 variables. Of course, the number of eggs and surviving fry, categorical variables, river, site, brood year, and parentage. We looked at egg weight, fines, scour, again, the Woolman counts for substrate particle size and embeddedness. We looked at the number of days in the gravel, and then also the accumulated temperature units at the time that the egg boxes were recovered. So the modeling goals for these then were threefold. So first, descriptive. We wanted to look at differences between rivers and sites, different spatial scales, and then estimate the variability that we had in our data. The second, again, knowing that this is an environmental study, trying to control for those confounds where we could to look at causal relationships with some of these variables where we could in survival. And then last but not least, of course, predictive, using all the information that we had to try to generate reasonably good estimates of egg to fry survival that would be useful to others. So the general model structure is just binomial logistic regression with some pretty weakly informative priors centered on 0, and then exponential for the variance component. So this is the variable intercept model, and so as we would expect, a pretty tight fit to the data. So the density of the data there in black, and then posterior poles in blue, just to show that that fits fairly closely. And then with that, we can look at differences among our river systems that we looked at. And so here, coefficient values, and we're choosing those that have all negative or all positive values as evidence that there's some difference here from the mean values. And so we found 4 river systems, the Wenatchee, the Teanaway, the White, and Nason Creek, that had somewhat lower survival than the others. And on the other end of the spectrum, we saw the Twist, the Entiat, and the Cle Elum. And so knowing these systems a little bit, so those upper 3 are pretty stable systems comparatively. And at least 3 of the 4 on the bottom there are areas where we see higher degrees of fines and scour. And just for some perspective then, the range kind of in those median values between Nason Creek and Twist there is about a 35% span in the probability of survival. So we can do this by site as well, so we can get to a smaller spatial scale. Here, the Entiat is not present because none of them met this particular criteria. But I thought it would be interesting to show you what kind of the extreme values look like that we saw for egg to fry survival. So our lowest is down here in Meadow River 9. So of the 130 sites, and this is what the Meadow site is. Looks pretty good, right? Flows are good. Substrate side looks pretty good. You can see our buckets out there before we've put our egg boxes in the gravel. But then 2 weeks later, it looks like this. And so this happened every year, all 3 years. And so the model is fairly confident that survival here is poor. On the other end of the spectrum, though, interesting, this is in the Meadow as well, the highest survival that we saw. And I find this quite interesting because, gosh, it looks pretty similar. So flows are good. And in this instance, no dewatering, things remained really well. And so when you look in the literature, published values for Chinook survival, it generally falls around the 50% mark. And here we saw survivals that were just generally really high for whatever, over the 3 years that we looked at this data. So I also wanted to say a word about within site variance because it's a common question of what are the levels of fines or what are the level of scour in a particular area of the river. And what we find is for about half of our replicates, we can probably give you a pretty good estimate of that. But we saw a lot of within site variation. I think it's really interesting because these are reds that are usually within a few meters of one another. And so here for scour, you can see that it's quite wide for some of those sites. And the same holds true for fines as well. Okay, so these are our adjusted estimates, so these would be the causal models, and what we find is that we had relationships for those that are in yellow here, scour, fines, river, which I've shown, and I'll show you mating in a moment. We did not find an effect for egg weight or number of days in the gravel, at least within our data set. The largest effect size was with scour. And what we found is that the overall scour just across all of our replicates was about 4 centimeters. And what we find is that you get some scour and you get quite a bit of effect essentially for that. And so on average, we saw about a 21% reduction in the probability of survival at that mean level. And we could say the same for fines. Now this is total effect on fines, and this is because we can't account for things like upwelling. So this is kind of a combined effect for those, perhaps negative effect due to fines, but there may also be some positive effect for upwelling that we can't account for. But generally we saw roughly a 14% level of fines just across our design. And that translated about a 3% reduction in the probability of survival, and over the entire range of values that we saw, on average, about a 16% reduction in the probability of survival. Mating was one that we thought we might see a bigger effect for. So in the Yakima, we had the ability to detect differences in survival attributable to mating when conditions were favorable. And so I think here we're seeing that conditions are generally not as favorable. This is a sample size now of 103 different matings, and we find that we do have some effect, but it's pretty small and probably what you would expect kind of in a normal distribution. Okay, and so predictive models. So we generated a number of these models and ranked these using k-fold. And so what we find is that fairly simple models, those are highlighted in yellow, provide reasonable estimates compared to more complex models. So knowing the river is beneficial, so there's probably something there that we're not keying in on that's present. And then if we don't know the location that we're coming from, scour, depth, and fine seems to provide a reasonable estimate compared to some more complex models as well. So our Woolman count data, our embeddedness, and our gravel size, we looked at this separately. We had some issues with methodology. So this is about 80% of the data set the same way. And what we found is that we did have some evidence, some slight evidence of increased predictability using gravel size and embeddedness, but only when we knew the river and had a measure of scour. So this is our best predictive model then. That's a single intercept, right? And what we find is that our model just tends to be a little more skeptical of extreme values, but otherwise provides fair estimates given the data that we're given it. And so in summary, we find that site and scour differences are apparent for sure. Within site variance is something I'm very interested in because this seems to be pretty broad, and I think it's something we're going to have to take into account. Scour and fines both appear to have a substantial effect in determining survival and to a lesser extent mating. And from a predictive standpoint, if we know location, or even if we don't know location, if we know scour depth and fines to some degree, then we can improve estimates of survival. So a ton of people have helped with this project over the years, so it's a really long-term project, and so I want to emphasize how important these people are, and just a huge thank you. There's no way we could have done this without just an army of people helping out. And that's it. And if there's time, I'll take questions. No time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and our final speaker of the session before the Q&A is Lance Campbell. His talk is on describing successful juvenile spring Chinook life histories in the Wenatchee and Entiat Rivers, emphasis on migration pathways, non-natal habitat use, and growth. Thank you.
What a title. Wow, that's a lot. I don't think we're going to cover all that, but we'll get into it. We heard some good talks early on kind of describing both the habitat trends and the population abundances trends and the importance of life history. We heard Mark's talk about pit-tagged, known pit-tagged wild fish and their life history and their returns. What we're going to talk about here today is both some of those same pit-tagged fish as known voucher samples, but also what the untagged, unmarked fish are doing. So we're going to get at that by looking at the otolith chemistry and growth of the fish to describe some life history patterns. So just kind of the crux of this research is this notion. I mean, it's been really fascinating. It's taken us in a lot of different directions, but for this talk, we're kind of really bear down on this notion of that typical yearling life history that we see in spring Chinook. Is that the dominating life history that we see? And there's been this prevailing thought until more recently that that is in fact the dominant life history, and all that other production we see out of the smolt traps, that's more excess production, that the habitat becomes fully seeded, these fish move and don't survive. So we're essentially testing that hypothesis. Is the typical yearling migrant the only one, or are there other life history strategies surviving? And it becomes quite clear that the importance to those other strategies for recovery and habitat restorations is essential. So I think we saw Mark present some juvenile outmigration data. It looked a lot better. This is just some data that Josh shared with me. I put together last night. What you should really take away from this, so if we're measuring juvenile outmigrants at these various traps, there's some variation between years, and that the non-yearling pattern makes up a sizable contribution, really a large group of fish. This isn't corrected for any kind of survival or mortality of those strategies. So we'd expect it to see it skewed a little bit more towards yearlings if we did do that. But we're really trying to figure out is these life histories that we see leaving the traps, how do they actually contribute to those returning adults? So we're, like I mentioned, we're doing that by looking at the microchemistry of the otolith and the growth of the otolith to make some inferences about what these fish are doing and where they're going. The key things you need to know from this is that in general, there's a fish size, otolith size relationship that allows us to make some predictions on the otolith when any kind of chemical event might occur that allows us to back calculate a size at that point. The next thing is this relationship between the element strontium and seawater. So we're able to detect that transition from that habitat from freshwater to seawater because seawater is found with high levels of strontium in general, and freshwater environments are generally low in strontium. So we're doing two different types of chemical analysis here. One, an elemental analysis, looking at a suite of elements, and another looking at the isotopic ratio of strontium 87 to 86. So this is our water chemistry data. What you should note, I guess if I point at this screen, you guys aren't going to see that, so that's not helpful. But what you need to take away from this is there's really large differences in isotopic strontium in the Columbia River and its cascade draining streams. So the Entiat and the Wenatchee both are almost 3 times lower in this isotopic value than the Columbia. And why that's important is that gets incorporated into the otolith, and we can see that transition when a fish moves from that tributary and mainstem Wenatchee habitat into the Columbia. The other thing we might just point out here is there's also some differences between water chemistry in the upper Columbia to the lower Columbia. Within the Wenatchee basin itself, we found some statistical differences between water chemistry, but when we looked at the otolith chemistry, while we found some differences on certain samples, we didn't see it on others. So right now we're not presenting kind of within basin movements solely based on water chemistry. Okay. The way we validated some of the patterns that we've described is, as Mark was saying, looking at the pit-tagged fish, there's this great, you guys are aware because you're the folks doing it, but there's this great suite of data where folks are tagging fish throughout the summer and fall, and in the spring as they outmigrate. And so we get a look at those fish, look at their otolith chemistry and say, okay, well, we know this fish was tagged, let's say, in April. So it's a known sample for being that typical yearling life history. We get another fish that would be tagged in, let's say, October, and we could use that as our voucher for a fall fish. Also of interest is known hatchery fish that, for the hatchery practices on the Chihuahua, these fish are being reared on Columbia water down at East Bank, brought to the Chihuahua rearing ponds, and overwintered there and then released in the spring. That gives us a great little time marker on the otolith to both validate the point at which we think the annulus forms and validates the otolith chemistry in the Columbia rearing and the Chihuahua too. Okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. We're going to look at 3 or 4 examples of this. These are what we call just life history profiles of individual fish. The top graph is elemental strontium, and the bottom graph is isotopic strontium. So while we're using strontium for both of those, they're measuring different things. So that's really important to keep in mind. And it would be helpful probably to have a pointer on this case, but this is our known hatchery migrant, the one I just kind of covered that was brought to the Chihuahua in the fall, overwintered, and then released in the spring. And you see that green chunk of otolith growth there. That's the otolith that's growing while in the in this case, the Columbia, and you see on the lower graph how it has elevated isotopic strontium, and then you see that drop off as that fish was moved to the Chihuahua and then reared there, and then you see a rise again in that isotopic strontium associated with it leaving and migrating to the ocean. So another known pit-tagged fish. This is a wild fish, that typical migrant. You notice it's really similar from an elemental standpoint to that hatchery fish, except the isotopic signal is actually the reverse. It spent its whole life in the Chihuahua, and then we see just a small increase in isotopic strontium right before it went to the ocean, and that would be associated with its rearing and growth in the Columbia itself. We estimate, based on how big how much growth occurred there, that was probably really in the measure of a couple weeks to a month time frame, that migration. This would be the typical yearling life history that we see. So this is where it starts to get interesting. Here's one of those known pit-tagged fish, in this case, how the Chihuahua, you see I've enumerated it here. I can't quite read it, but this fish was pit-tagged in October of, I think it was 2016 or 2015. In the fall, we know how big the fish was at that point. We can back calculate what size that was on the otolith. That's the marker that you see here. So in this sense, we do get a little bit of measure of the tributary growth in gray there, associated with that kind of amber color growth that we assume is between when the fish was actually, the size at which it was tagged, to its actual contact with Columbia River water. And what you see in this case is the estimate that the fish had left the Chihuahua in the fall, in October, had spent a significant amount of time in the Wenatchee, and then entered the Columbia probably in the December, January time frame, and then spent a significant amount of time in the Columbia itself. And that's obvious by, you see that high on the bottom graph, that high signal there in the light green. So those were a few of the known fish. And here's a fish showing just kind of a little more extreme life history in the Chihuahua again. You see this early in gray, the early freshwater growth in the Chihuahua. This fish wasn't tagged with any kind of pit tagged, but we see that there was this natural chemical tag of it dropping down into the Columbia River that occurs quite early in its life. We estimate that's probably in that September, October, November kind of time frame, and then overwintering and spending significant amounts of time there. And of interest is the growth that's accumulating during that time as well. While in the Chihuahua, in a lot of these tributary systems, as you are probably well aware of, that overwinter growth starting in late October or October through March, growth is really restricted. While in this example, this fish has dropped down to the Columbia River, probably in that fall time frame, late fall time frame, and by the time it goes out to the ocean, it's put on an additional approximately 50 millimeters of growth, so quite substantial. So for the different systems that we looked at, the Entiat and then the Wenatchee, and then the two tributaries that we looked at within the Wenatchee, the Chihuahua and the Nason, we looked at the spawning ground samples that you all collected and partitioned them into their use of the Columbia River based on if it occurred before or after that annulus, that otolith annulus that we think occurs around mid-March. And we partitioned them into these groups. So a way to think about this, and I got to do a little work on maybe jazzing this up, but of the returning adults that were sampled on the spawning grounds and that we randomly sampled those otoliths, 20% of those fish showed evidence that they were in the Columbia sometime between the fall and winter months. And of interest, though a lower sample size, we see the Entiat was substantially different from that, much higher, approximately 40% in the Entiat, 50% in the Nason. If we partitioned it out, and I didn't really go into this, but if we partitioned it out further, not only on the chemistry, but on the growth of the fish. So if we took all those known pit tag fish that we had that had left the system in the fall, and all the known yearling fish that we left, and just looked at their growth, it appears that there's a bunch of fish that are dropping down into the main stem Wenatchee. Probably didn't make a lot of sense, but we have reason to believe that that number, that approximately 70% of spring migrants to the Columbia from the Wenatchee, probably about half of those are in the tributary and about half of those are in the main stem Wenatchee. What else to note on here? There was a couple of examples in the Chihuahua, one being a fish that survived that had left at a very small size that entered the Columbia in approximately 50 millimeters, 45, 50 millimeters. So that puts it in that kind of spring fry migrant life history type. So pretty rare. It was just one out of 100, maybe, yeah, about 100 fish. Whether that was maybe actually a summer Chinook that was sampled in the spring Chinook population, I'm unsure. And I think the other one that was a little bit of a outlier was more of a summer, more of this 65, 70 millimeter size range that probably left sometime in August. In the Entiat, the couple little interesting fish, and made a little bit more sense when I heard Kevin's talk, was the proportion of hatchery fish. We found some untagged hatchery fish on the spawning grounds, and we found also a small, well, significant portion, it was something, yeah, 7% of fish that appeared to be out of basin strays. So not hatchery fish, but not fish that, based on their freshwater chemistry, actually resided in the Entiat before. So to the right, this graph here on the right, the x-axis is otolith growth. Otolith growth occurring in the Columbia River based on that isotopic signal, and we haven't transformed this back to days, but that's one of the things that we do is we. Oh, sorry, I didn't even see it. What are we at? One? Let's do one. Okay. Okay. Well, we can wrap this up. Let's see if there's anything else. Actually, this is the one interesting point to make. Is so why are these life histories, these fall life histories that we're seeing? What would potentially be the driving force for that? And when we look at the temperature in the Columbia River and the tributaries, what we notice in that fall time frame is that if you drop out of the Wenatchee, Chihuahua into the Wenatchee or the Columbia, you're probably extending your growth period by an additional 2 to 3 months, and that was evident from that example that we used where we saw that really extended growth period. And then just a thank you to all the funders and all the folks that actually collected all this great data that we were able to use. Thanks a lot.
No worries. Well, you can actually stay up here, and I'm going to invite all the speakers from that session up here to sit behind these microphones, and then I invite everyone else to please come up to the standing microphone with your questions, or we have one mic runner over here, so you can raise your hand and he can bring you a microphone as well. Yeah, thank you to all of our speakers again. That was very interesting. We invited you up here to just wave at everyone. And
I can keep talking.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. I had a question for Mark. Do you have any idea about what the differences might be with that designation of life histories, and since a lot of that's based on pit tags put in as screw traps during times when that screw trap can operate, being the downstream rearing time, versus the spring when it might not be operating due to flows? How do you kind of get around that? Is there additional electrofishing in some of these tributaries?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. We didn't analyze data other than the screw trap data. So my understanding is that there is electrofishing up in the tributaries, which would probably provide some information, certainly some additional information on life history expression, but just haven't looked at that. I thought that there was pretty good continuity in the operation of the screw traps during the spring, but certainly I think winter is probably the biggest hole in the screw trap data, where I'm not sure how many fish are leaving.
I think that might be something worth looking into. I'm working up in the Lemhi River, and that's something that I'm directly looking at, and we have more electrofishing efforts outside of that, because a lot of those downstream rearing fish are on their way out. The screw traps are located at the confluence, so you might be missing a portion of that life history.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the screw traps are kind of an arbitrary point in space, right? The fish don't know that they're above or below a screw trap. We try to put them below the spawning habitat, I guess.
Right.
But yeah, when you electrofish, I guess you get fish, and also you're getting them before they move, so maybe you can get some information on survival, you know, during rearing, before movement, which could be interesting to compare to the survival of fish after they move, which I think would be really interesting. Again, getting at differences in survival during the same time period for fish in different areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great talks, everybody. I have a question, I think for all of you, but somewhat directed at Mark, about sort of this downstream migrant life history that a few of you hit on. And I'm wondering if there's any evidence, you're sort of showing averages of the proportions of these downstream migrant life histories. How much variation is there potentially year to year in those proportions? Have you explored that in your data set? I guess variation in two factors, variation in the proportion of fish that are exhibiting that life history, and then variation in the survival of those migrants from year to year as well. In other words, are there years when that life history is actually sort of a stabilizing factor for the populations? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Great question. And I think the answer is yes. I think we did look into that, and we did see quite a bit of that kind of portfolio effect from the juvenile life history diversity. I think it's probably coming from both of those aspects, both survival before they get to the screw trap and in downstream habitats when they're in different areas. So I think just last week, one of the chapters from my dissertation came out in Canadian Journal of Fisheries Sciences, and it touches on that topic, on you know, how synchronous are these different life history pathways, and how much do they stabilize the population, and it's substantial. Yeah. Thank you.
Got a question for Christopher. Considering that the river itself seemed to be an important variable, have you considered bringing in the physical characteristics of the watershed or floodplain to look at, things like mean basin slope, mean elevation, confinement, and entrenchment, considering that it seems to be kind of sediment that seems to be the biggest impact on the reds?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, this data set's really a couple of stories. So I had looked at this in the Wenatchee to begin with. And at that time, before I moved into the Bayesian framework, I was looking at a spatial stream networking model, which would incorporate some of that type of information. And at that time, that particular variable was not helpful from an explanatory purpose, for a particular purpose, which isn't to say, of course, that it's not. And so, but that's not something that I've done to add to this framework, but it's something that I certainly hope to do in the future, because I see now that you can use the Bayesian framework within the spatial stream networking models as well, but I've not yet done that. And you know, the other component of this is the interannual variance as well is something that's really interesting to me, because we've seen some differences along that scale, but I think that in some of these environments you could be looking at a much longer time frame before you could really incorporate some of the differences that you'd see from year to year. Is that?
Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
What program are you building the Bayesian network in? I'm just curious.
STAN. These are STAN models. STAN.
Okay.
STAN. So it's either RSTAN or I'm an R guy, so it's either RSTAN or Command STAN.
Cool.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I've got a question for Lance. I don't know very much. I'll preface this by saying I don't know that much about otolith chemistry, but the way the strontium markers, the way you were talking about is that it's mostly from water chemistry, and I was wondering what can we learn from the otoliths about diet, about what fish are eating along the way. And I know this is coming from a little background on the near ocean where we learned that big shift for Chinook from zooplankton to piscivory is a big turning point for survival. Do we have other turning points along the way that we can learn from otolith chemistry on what they're eating?
Yeah, I think we do. It's a little bit outside of the type of otolith work I do. Diet work tends to be carbon and nitrogen based. It's a little tougher with otoliths based on the type of material that's needed for that. So to have the resolution that we're talking about, which is kind of getting down to the days to weeks, with the carbon and nitrogen, my understanding has been much more from a dissolved matter. So a little bit different scale and a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but there are some folks that are kind of looking at it from a more trophic standpoint.
Thank you.
So I guess I'll direct this question to Chris or Kevin. No, I'll stay with Chris. I think you saw a scour effect that was something less than the 30 centimeters that you buried your egg boxes. So it didn't have to scour all the way down the egg box to have an effect.
Yeah, not at all.
So a question just occurred to me. Did you, in any of your sites, did you ever have the opposite effect? Did you ever have a deposition event? And did that seem to have any kind of effect on survival?
That's a really good question. So the data do include deposition as a measure, but it was more difficult to measure deposition than scour. So we're using a scour chain to measure. You know, we get a really accurate measure of that.
Yeah.
Deposition means somebody's standing out there trying to measure the distance between. You know, we did see that. I think that we would probably need to look at things like swim up, probably to encompass the mortality that may occur from deposition, and we don't see that. And the frequency of deposition that we saw was relatively small, and so I've not looked at it directly, you know, with a subset of the data set to see if there was an actual influence to survival. Because of that, it wouldn't surprise me, because I think that what we've seen is that small amounts of scour, just at least on average, are apparently affecting flow conditions in a negative way to those reds. It really doesn't take much bed load movement to I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is, but definitely it's there. And I would suppose that it's very likely that deposition, especially if it's large, would have a similar effect. Yeah.
But you didn't have, in your data, you didn't have any kind of sites that really saw like
Huge
yeah,
deposition.
like sometimes you see
Yeah.
like a foot or more.
Yeah, no, I don't recall seeing those in the data. We had some scour events that were catastrophic. But, and presumably with those you'd get deposition to different areas, but I don't recall any of those specifically within our data set. It was usually smaller than that.
And one more follow-up question.
Yeah.
In natural reds,
Yeah.
were you measuring, or do you know of kind of what the average scour event occurs in natural sites versus the sites that you picked?
Okay.
I know you didn't actually go out and put scour chains near natural reds.
No, I didn't. But I'm sure that those data are out there. I'm trying to think of a particular, I know there's a couple of papers that have covered this, but I'm also thinking that it differs probably greatly by river system because the flows are so different. So even in the ones that we looked at between like Nason Creek and stuff, so it would be difficult. So are you suggesting there may be a difference in the probability of scour between an artificial red and a natural red?
I was trying to put your results in context of what's happened out there for natural reds.
Right.
So we know when we go back and visit natural reds, they're often flattened out.
Right.
So something has happened that disturbed that tail spill that now they're not like a brand new red.
Yeah.
So so I guess my point is your results different from what's happening naturally, kind of like as a baseline, or how far off, or
well, or
does it matter?
Yeah, it probably matters to some extent. So we've tried to select habitats. We've tried to allow the Chinook to direct us to those habitats. So we're using a mean value of egg burial depth, and I would assume that if you had a population that evolved in a system that was much higher flow conditions, that maybe you might even have deeper burial depths to protect that, and probably the opposite. We do have, and I hesitate to mention this, so we did have a smaller study that we did in the Yakima where we looked at egg burial depth in terms of survival between the two, where we buried these at 30 centimeters and also at 15. And found no difference there, but the caveat is that that's in the Yakima, which is highly regulated, and so I mean you can still see the reds in the spring, and so it might be a very different story in the Wenatchee. So I don't have a definitive answer for whether or not there's some sort of difference between our reds and like a natural reds. I would suppose that there are definitely some. In egg burial depth alone, just because we're using a standard. And so I think we just need to keep that in mind when we're looking at scour events.
Cool. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Good talks, everybody.
All right, thank you, everybody. I want to make sure everyone gets a break. Please, find them during the break and ask more questions if you would like to, or continue these conversations outside, but we will come back to start our talks again at 11, so try to come back a couple minutes before 11, please. That will be helpful. And thank you again to all of our speakers. That was fantastic.